The morning light hesitated on the glass towers, clean, distant, and wordless. Inside, one of them sat a woman who used to command rooms with a single phrase. Now, silence was her only language. Since the crash, her world had become a series of gestures, brief nods, written notes, half smiles. The boardroom still feared her precision, but her voice, the sound that built empires, was gone. One afternoon, her car stalled near a small repair shop outside the city, grease on concrete, tools humming. A man with quiet hands looked up from beneath the hood. When she tried to speak, nothing came. Instead, he wiped his hands, reached for a torn invoice, and wrote, "You're still heard." The city still began its days with noise, elevators sighing, heels striking marble, screens waking into light. But inside the corner office on the 43rd floor, silence held its ground. Ilara Voss stood before the window, her reflection faint against the morning glare. The skyline below moved with purpose. People speaking, calling, arguing, living, all through sound. She pressed her fingers lightly against her throat, as if searching for the echo that used to live there. Nothing. Only the faint pulse of her own skin. On her desk, a stack of memos waited, signed with her neat initials. Her handwriting had become her new voice. Clean, distant, efficient. Her assistant Mara entered quietly, carrying the day's briefing notes. "Meeting at 10 with the board," Mara said softly. Her eyes avoided Ilara's for too long. Ilara nodded once, picked up her pen, and wrote on the corner of the schedule. "Tell them I'll listen." Mara smiled weakly. "Of course." It was always like that now. People filling in her silence with kindness that never quite reached her. The accident had been a year ago. Rain, a curved road, headlights cutting through fog. Her voice had been injured by the seatbelt's violent hold. The doctors said permanent, in the careful tone reserved for facts that cannot be softened. At first, she believed she could rebuild herself with discipline. She learned hand signals, wrote faster, trained her posture to command the room without words. But what left her undone were the moments no one saw. The empty mornings when her voice tried to rise from habit and met air instead. The company had survived. The board adjusted. But a part of her leadership, that sharp, vocal certainty, had gone missing. Now she moved through her empire like a figure behind glass, visible, unreachable. That morning, the conference room smelled faintly of coffee and steel. Screens glowed with profit charts, and the air hummed with professional restraint. Ilara sat at the head of the table, her hands folded, listening as others filled the space with words. "The numbers are strong, but morale's slipping," one director said. "She's right. Communication feels distant," added another. No one looked directly at her when they spoke. They talked around her silence, like it was an empty chair. Ilara took a notepad and wrote, "Morale follows meaning. You can't delegate that." Mara read it aloud, her voice steady but thin. The words landed, but not the presence behind them. For a moment, Ilara's pen hovered. She wanted to say something, not just to instruct, but to speak, to let sound carry her conviction again. Her breath caught instead, quiet and incomplete. She lowered the pen. Outside, thunder gathered without rain. When the meeting ended, the others left in a polite drift. Mara lingered by the door. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Ilara looked up, the question hanging between them. She gave a small nod, then wrote, "Fine. Go rest, Mara." The truth was smaller. She wasn't fine, but she had grown fluent in silence, and it made people comfortable. As the door closed, she exhaled slowly, fingertips tracing the rim of her empty coffee cup. The porcelain edge was smooth, unbroken, something she could still control. The city outside pressed on, horns, wind, voices, and she watched it without sound. Every life seemed to carry music she no longer had access to. At dusk, she left the tower. Her driver was off that week, so she took her own car, a quiet hybrid that hummed more than it roared. The rain returned, light but persistent. She drove without destination, streets blurring into each other. Neon signs streaked across her windshield like stray thoughts. Somewhere beyond the downtown glow, the buildings thinned. Her headlights caught the reflection of an old warehouse, half converted into auto shops. She felt the car lurch. A warning light blinked on the dash. Engine fault. The vehicle slowed, coughing into stillness near a shuttered garage. Ilara sighed, a soundless breath, and checked her phone. No signal. The rain thickened, drumming lightly on the roof. She stepped out, shoes meeting puddles with careful precision. Across the lot, a faint light glowed through a half-opened door. She hesitated, then walked toward it. Inside, warmth. The air smelled of oil and iron, a low radio hum threading through the space. Tools lined the walls like a language of their own. A man knelt beside an old pickup, hands deep in its engine. He looked up briefly. Mid-30s, calm eyes, a faint streak of grease across his cheek. "Evening," he said. Elara raised a small notepad she carried for such moments. She wrote, "Car broke down outside. Can you look?" He wiped his hands and nodded. "Sure, give me a sec." She waited, arms crossed, watching the rain slide off the open doorway. When he stepped out to inspect her car, she followed silently. Umbrella tilted just enough to shelter him too. He noticed, almost smiled. "Thanks," she only nodded. The sound of rain filled what words could not. He leaned into the engine bay, light catching the small movements of his hands. "Fuel lines loose," he murmured. "Simple fix." She wrote on her pad. "How long?" 10 minutes. He worked with quiet precision. No wasted motion, no noise. She found herself watching his rhythm, the way care lived in his gestures rather than his words. When he was done, he straightened and wiped his palms on a rag. "All good now," he said. She pulled out her wallet, offering a card. He shook his head. "Don't worry about it." Elara hesitated, unused to refusal. She wrote, "At least let me pay properly." He chuckled, not mocking, just gentle. "You already did. You waited in the rain." She looked at him, not sure what to make of the answer. For a moment, neither moved. The rain softened, the city's noise faded behind them. She tore a page from her notepad and wrote, "Thank you." He nodded once. "Any time." As she turned to leave, he spoke again, quieter this time. "Take care of your voice." The words hit somewhere deep, not pity, but awareness. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away. Before she could respond, he was already back inside, tools resuming their quiet song. Later that night, Elara parked in her building's underground garage. She sat in the car longer than usual, hands resting on the steering wheel. The faint smell of oil clung to her sleeve. A trace of that small garage, that man's quiet decency. She reached for her notebook again and wrote 3 words without knowing why. "Still heard," somehow. Then she tore out the page and folded it, as if the act of keeping it mattered more than the words themselves. Upstairs, the city moved beneath her windows, silent, bright, relentless. But for the first time in a year, the silence around her didn't feel like absence. It felt like space, waiting for something to be written into it. Morning returned without ceremony. The city's sound seeped through glass. Car horns, elevators, distant music from somewhere below. Elara sat at her kitchen counter, spoon motionless in her coffee. The steam lifted gently, then vanished. The folded page from the night before lay beside her. The one that said "still heard," somehow. She read it again, not as reassurance, but as proof that someone, somewhere, had noticed her silence and didn't turn away from it. Outside, the world kept its rhythm. Inside, she felt unanchored, like a sentence missing its verb. By 8, she was back in the office. The building hummed with routine. Assistants greeting, doors opening, phones ringing in careful tones. Mara followed behind her with a small tablet and a list of meetings. "Your voice therapist confirmed for Thursday," she said softly. "They're still optimistic about small recovery." Elara paused in front of the elevator, her reflection caught in the mirrored doors. Optimistic, a word that belonged to other people now. She nodded once, then wrote on her tablet. "Schedule stays the same." "No changes," Mara hesitated. "You don't have to." Elara raised her hand slightly, not harsh, just decisive. The conversation ended there. The elevator opened. Silence followed her in. The executive floor smelled of old paper and polished ambition. Her staff respected her precision, her quiet efficiency, but they feared the stillness she carried. It wasn't anger, but something colder, restraint. In meetings, voices filled the air, chasing her approval. When she nodded, pens moved. When she frowned, strategies shifted. But beneath it all, she felt like a ghost moving through someone else's company, one she built with words she could no longer speak. On the long wall opposite her desk hung a photograph, An old company event, back when her voice filled the room with command. She studied it sometimes, not out of nostalgia, but to remind herself that she had once existed in sound. By midday, fatigue set in, not physical, but sensory. Too many voices, too many people, translating meaning through noise. She escaped to the building's rooftop garden, where wind replaced chatter. The city stretched beneath her, grey and endless. She wrote briefly in her notebook, noise everywhere. Still nothing heard. A few minutes later, Mara appeared, carrying her phone. There's someone downstairs from the maintenance contractor. Says he needs your approval for a supply invoice. Ilara frowned. That was unusual. Most approvals went through email. Still, she nodded. Send him in. The man who entered her office later that afternoon wasn't what she expected. Grease under his nails, rolled sleeves, steady posture. Jonas, the mechanic from the night before. He carried a clipboard, though it was clear he didn't belong in the usual rhythm of her world. Ms. Voss? He asked, tentative. She blinked, surprised. He continued. Didn't mean to intrude. Just, this invoice has your name. I figured it's a mistake. Mara looked uncertain, but Ilara gestured for him to sit. He didn't. Instead, he set the clipboard on her desk and waited. She picked up her pen. You work with the maintenance division? He nodded. Yeah, contract work, part-time. The city sent a new lot of us to your buildings. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You fixed my car yesterday. Jonas smiled faintly. Didn't think you'd remember. She wrote, you left an impression. He chuckled once, not flattered, just understanding. Most people forget the quiet ones. She looked at him for a moment longer, then signed the paper. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed. A brief contact that felt oddly grounding. He turned to leave, but then paused, hand on the doorframe. Your car's running fine? She nodded. Good, he said, almost softly. Machines listen better than people sometimes. And then he was gone. After he left, Ilara found herself unable to return to her emails. The words on her screen blurred. Numbers, contracts, phrases stripped of warmth. Machines listen better than people sometimes. She wrote the line in her notebook, as if testing its weight. Then she underlined it once. The rest of the day unfolded as usual. Controlled, productive, wordless. But something small had shifted, like the faint movement of a curtain when the air changes direction. That evening, she walked home instead of calling a car. The street smelled of rain and hot pavement. Shop windows flickered with quiet stories. A tailor stitching by hand. A child laughing into a phone. A baker locking up. She paused at a red light and watched people talk. Mouths moving. Laughter spilling. Arguments beginning and ending in the span of a signal. For the first time, she wondered not about losing her voice, but about how often people used theirs without really meaning anything. Noise without meaning. That was the world she'd built her empire in. Maybe she had been silent long before the accident. At home, she set her bag down and turned on a small lamp. The apartment was spare, ordered, a reflection of her mind before the crash. She walked to the window, the city lights pressing like stars that forgot how to be far away. Her reflection looked back at her, poised, composed, unreadable, but something about the day lingered. That mechanic's steadiness, the way he looked through silence instead of around it. She took out the old page again, the one that said, still heard somehow. Then she added beneath it, in smaller handwriting, maybe meaning is quieter than sound. She left the paper by the window, letting the lamplight hold it. Days followed, meetings, signatures, gestures, but each morning she noticed small things differently. The hum of the elevator, the rhythm of footsteps down the hall, the soft rasp of pen against paper. She began to watch how people listened. Most waited for their turn to speak. Few really heard. When Jonas came again a week later, it was for a scheduled inspection. Mara met him at reception, but Ilara appeared halfway through. He greeted her with a nod, hands in pockets. Didn't think I'd see you twice. She smiled faintly, the kind that meant more than politeness. She wrote, I own the building. You'll probably see me again. He grinned. Then I'll make sure not to scratch the marble. Something in her almost laughed, or tried to. A small sound caught in her throat, low but real. She stopped, startled by it. Jonas noticed but didn't react. Instead, he said quietly, That's something. She met his eyes. For the first time, her silence didn't feel like weakness. It felt like space, a place where something could grow. When he left, she lingered by the door. The scent of machine oil trailed faintly after him, mixing with the sterile air of her office. It was a scent out of place here, human, grounded, unpretentious. She looked down at her notepad. Her fingers moved before she could think. He listens without asking for sound. Then she closed the notebook, pressing her palm against its cover, as if sealing a thought too fragile for the world outside. That night, rain began again, soft, persistent, familiar. Alara stood by the window as lightning flickered over the skyline. The world looked clean, almost new. She touched her throat, not searching for what was lost this time, but acknowledging what remained. Her voice was gone, but her silence had started to speak. The morning began with a sharp chill, autumn's first warning. Mist hung low over the streets, turning everything into outlines. Alara stood in the lobby of her building, coat draped over one arm, waiting for her car. When the valet handed over her keys, she nodded, then paused before getting in. The memory of that night, the rain, the roadside, the sound of tools, returned with strange warmth. She started the car. The hum felt steady, reassuring. But halfway down the expressway, a flicker of warning lights appeared again. She sighed, quiet, resigned, and guided the car toward the nearest exit. The engine stuttered once, then died. She coasted to a stop beside an old gas station. The sign above it had faded letters, and a familiar small garage stood behind. For a moment she sat still, her hands gripping the wheel. It couldn't be coincidence. Then, from inside, a familiar voice. "You've got the strangest timing." Jonas stood by the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. The same calm ease as before. Alara stepped out, notebook already in hand. She wrote, "It happened again. I think it misses you." He read it, laughed softly. "Machines do get attached, you know." She handed him the keys. He slid into the driver's seat, turned the ignition, listened. "Fuel pump," he murmured. "You must have caught a bad replacement part." She watched him work, sleeves rolled up, breath visible in the cold. His movements were quiet but certain, each gesture deliberate. No noise, no rush, just care. Inside the small office, she waited while he fetched tools. The space was cluttered, papers pinned to the wall, coffee rings on the desk, a half-finished crossword near an open ledger. A photo sat on the counter. A woman and a small boy, both laughing into the wind. The boy held a toy car. Jonas noticed her gaze when he came back. "My sister and nephew," he said. "They live up north." She wrote, "He looks like you." He smiled faintly. Poor kid. He crouched beside the car again, tools clinking softly. "You don't talk much," he added, not as a question. Alara hesitated, then flipped the notebook toward him. "Can't. Accident." He looked up, eyes steady. "Sorry, I didn't mean—" She waved it off. "You're fine." He nodded, then said quietly, "You must miss it, though. The talking." She watched his hands tighten a bolt, the muscles in his forearm flexing under the grease. Then she wrote, "More than I thought I would." Jonas sat back on his heels. "My nephew's been deaf since birth. People assume silence means emptiness. It doesn't." Alara met his eyes. Something in the way he said it, gentle, certain, felt heavier than pity. It was knowledge. When the repair finished, he leaned against the hood, wiping his hands again. "All done. Same as before, but stronger." She scribbled, "You should invoice me this time." He smiled. "How about a coffee instead?" She looked at him, not surprised but measuring. Then she nodded. The small diner across the street was quiet, windows fogged with warmth. They sat by the window, the scent of coffee grounding the silence. Jonas stirred his cup absently. "So," he said, "what does someone like you do when the world stops listening?" Alara wrote, "Build higher walls, then pretend they're windows." He chuckled, but the humor didn't quite reach his eyes. "And does that work?" She paused. For a while. The waitress passed by, refilling cups. Outside, the traffic hissed against wet pavement. Jonas looked down at her notebook again. "You ever wish you could yell?" She tapped her throat lightly. "Every day." He nodded, then said quietly, "Sometimes I wish I could stop talking. Words get heavy when nobody means them." The air between them felt still, not awkward, just honest. Alara studied him, the oil stains on his fingers, the tired creases near his eyes, the small nick on his thumb from some forgotten repair. Every detail belonged to someone who lived with noise but never in it. She wrote, "You listen differently." He tilted his head. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then added, "You don't fill silence. You let it breathe." He sat back, thoughtful. Maybe silence is where people actually say things. They finished their coffee in quiet intervals. When she stood to leave, he followed her out. The sky had cleared. Late sun cut through the mist. Her car waited across the street, glinting faintly in the light. Jonas handed her the keys. "It'll hold now, promise." She wrote, "Do you always fix things this well?" He shrugged. "Only the ones that ask nicely." Her eyes softened. Something like the shadow of a smile, but restrained. She wrote one more line, tore the page, and handed it to him before stepping into the car. He unfolded it as she drove off. "You're better with silence than most people are with words." That night, Alara sat by her window again. The city glittered, distant and indifferent, but somewhere beyond those lights was a small garage, a man who understood what she could no longer say. She reached for her phone, typed a brief message to Mara. "Cancel Thursday's voice therapy." Her thumb hovered before she pressed send. She didn't know why. Perhaps because she wanted silence not as a wound, but as a space to listen differently. The message sent. Days passed. Jonas didn't call. Neither did she. But the absence didn't feel like loss. It felt like a pause, deliberate, calm. She noticed herself writing slower, fewer words. Meetings ran quieter but clearer. She started to observe again, the tremor in people's voices, the way they filled the air to hide uncertainty. And sometimes, in the middle of a crowded boardroom, she would remember that coffee shop, the stillness that didn't demand explanation. One evening, after a long meeting, she found a small envelope on her desk. No name, just a folded sheet inside written in uneven ink. Some engines stall not because they're broken, but because they need rest before moving again. There was no signature, but she knew the handwriting. Alara read the note twice, then set it beside the first one. Still heard somehow. She looked at both pages, one hers, one his, and felt something shift quietly inside her. Not healing, not resolution, just movement. Slow, deliberate, alive. Later that night, she walked out onto her balcony. The air was cold enough to sting. Far below, the city's sound blurred into a low hum. She closed her eyes, and though no sound came, her breath moved differently, as if some unseen rhythm had returned. A voice didn't have to be spoken to exist. The weeks that followed drifted in a quiet rhythm, meetings, drives, silence. But beneath that routine, something subtle had begun to form. Not change exactly, more like a current under still water. Alara had started taking the longer route home. It passed near the small garage. Sometimes she'd slow down as she drove by, half hoping to see the rolling door open, half afraid that she might. One Friday, she stopped. The afternoon light was low and golden, dust moving like memory through the air. The radio inside played faintly, an old jazz station, soft trumpet and vinyl crackle. Jonas was there, bent over an engine block, sleeves rolled, head bowed in thought. His hands moved in steady rhythm, tightening, turning, wiping. Work looked almost like prayer. He didn't notice her at first. She waited by the door, hesitant. Then, when he finally looked up, he gave a small nod. Not surprised, just acknowledging something inevitable. "Car trouble again?" he asked, a half smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She shook her head, holding up her notebook. "Not today." He leaned against the workbench. "That's new. You usually bring a problem." She wrote, "Maybe I brought coffee instead." His brows lifted in mock disbelief. "You coffee run?" She pointed to the 2 cups in her hand. He took one, still warm, and nodded his thanks. They stood there for a moment, the mechanic and the silent executive, drinking from mismatched cups as the radio hummed between them. The conversation, such as it was, happened mostly in pauses. He worked while she watched, the sound of wrenches and soft clinks filling the space where words might have gone. Occasionally, she wrote small things on her notepad. "Why do you still fix old cars?" He'd glance up. "Because new ones don't need people, just diagnostics. Old ones listen when you touch them." She considered that, then wrote, "You make silence sound like something alive." He smiled faintly. Maybe it is. The simplicity of it unsettled her. For years she'd treated silence as a problem to be solved. Jonas treated it like a companion, something to live beside, not escape from. Later, while he cleaned his tools, she walked around the shop. Her heels clicked softly against concrete. There were notes pinned to the walls, hand-scribbled reminders, half-done invoices, small doodles. Among them, a single yellow paper stood out. In shaky handwriting, it read, "Mum says you listen better than God." Jonas noticed her reading. "My nephew wrote that," he said, smiling. "When I fix his toys, he thinks I hear them talking." Alara traced the note with her eyes. "He sounds like you," she wrote. "Hope he's better," Jonas said quietly. Listening's heavy work. Something in the way he said it, plain, unguarded, sank deeper than any sympathy could. When she left that day, the sun had dipped low enough to paint the sky in muted amber. Jonas stood in the doorway as she started her car. "Come back when something else breaks," he said lightly. She nodded once, then pointed to her throat. A silent jest. "That might take a while," he grinned. "That's fine. I'm not going anywhere." In the days that followed, Alara found herself thinking differently. She began writing more by hand, not just for communication, but for feeling. The act itself, the friction of ink on paper, reminded her of the way Jonas moved, steady, deliberate. She filled pages with fragments. Listening is slower than speaking. Meaning needs silence to breathe. Some people fix engines, others fix stillness. Her handwriting loosened, less sharp, more human. The board noticed the change too. Her meetings became shorter, her expressions quieter, but her presence more grounded. When someone argued, she didn't interrupt. She waited. That pause unsettled people, then slowly made them more honest. Mara, watching from across the table, said after one meeting, "You seem calmer." Alara wrote, "Maybe I stopped trying to make noise." Mara frowned slightly. "But isn't that what leadership needs? Volume?" She shook her head, wrote, "No, just clarity," and that was the end of it. Another evening, near closing time, Alara drove back to the garage again. Jonas was locking up, hands still streaked with oil. He looked up when he saw her. "Didn't think I'd see you twice in a week." She lifted her notepad. "You didn't scratch the marble this time." He laughed, a low, easy sound. "So that's approval?" She wrote, "That's trust." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her for a long moment. "Most people don't give that away easily." She hesitated, then added, "I used to think trust came from power. Maybe it's the opposite." He nodded slowly. "Power's loud. Trust isn't." They stood like that, not quite close, not distant, the quiet between them full of something alive but undefined. After a while, he took a small piece of paper from the counter and handed it to her. Oil smudged, corners torn. In careful, uneven handwriting, it read, "You're still heard." She froze. The same words from their first meeting, but this time she could see the weight behind them. Not comfort, but recognition. Her hands trembled slightly as she traced the letters. Then she looked up. Jonas said nothing. His eyes did the speaking. That night, back in her apartment, she placed the note beside the earlier ones. Still heard somehow, and some engines stall for rest. 3 pieces of paper, 3 different silences. She stood there for a long while, the city pulsing beyond the glass. The world had not changed, but her way of standing in it had. She touched her throat again, a habit she couldn't quite break. Then softly she mouthed the words, barely forming sound. "You're still heard." No one else would have noticed, but the air around her did, the quiet kind that listens back. A week later, Alara received an invitation from a charity organization her company sponsored, a fundraiser for children with hearing impairments. Before, she would have declined automatically. Now, she wrote a single word on the RSVP card: attend. When she arrived that evening, dressed in black, the room was full of gentle noise, laughter, greetings, music. But near one corner, a small group signed to each other, fluid, precise, beautiful. She stood watching. One of the children noticed her and waved. She hesitated, then raised her hand, a clumsy but earnest wave in return. For a moment, she wasn't the CEO or the woman without a voice. She was simply someone listening differently. Later that night, when she returned home, the garage light across the street from her building flickered. A small reminder of something unchanged. She opened her notebook, wrote a single sentence, and left it open on the table. Some things don't need fixing, just to be understood. The ink dried slowly, as if even the page was learning patience. The city entered winter quietly, windows frosted at their edges, and the morning sky turned pale before sunrise. In the garage, Jonas worked with fingerless gloves, breath visible in the cold. The heater hummed weakly, struggling against the chill. Ilara hadn't been by in nearly 2 weeks. Not because she didn't want to, but because something inside her needed to see if silence could last without distance. Yet that morning, as she stood before her reflection, adjusting the collar of her coat, she caught sight of the note pinned to her mirror. "You're still heard." The edges had begun to curl. The ink had bled slightly from humidity, but the words remained. It was enough. When she arrived that afternoon, Jonas was kneeling beside a rusted motorcycle, his hair damp from rain. He looked up, surprised but not startled. "You're early for once." She lifted her notepad. "Or late. Depends who's counting." He laughed quietly. "Fair." The shop smelled of metal, cold, and something faintly sweet. Oil mixed with the sugar of an unfinished coffee. He gestured to the bike. "This one's older than me. Belonged to my dad." She tilted her head. "You fix it to remember him?" "More like to understand him," he said. "He used to think fixing things was how you talk to the world." She watched him for a moment, then wrote. Maybe he was right. He paused, leaning back against the wall. "What about you? You talk to the world any other way now?" Her pen hesitated before moving. "Writing helps. Listening too." Jonas nodded. "Listening's rare currency these days." They fell into silence again. The good kind, warm and unhurried. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal. After a while, she took out a folded paper from her coat pocket and placed it on the workbench. It was from the fundraiser, a photograph of the children signing together, hands mid-motion, faces lit with unguarded joy. Jonas picked it up. "You went?" She nodded. He looked at the image longer than expected, then said softly, "You must have felt at home there." Her eyes lowered. "In a way." Then she added, "They don't fill silence. They decorate it." He smiled, that slow, unforced kind that reached the eyes. "That's beautiful." She tapped the paper, wrote, "It's true." The rain turned heavier outside, streaking against the windows. Jonas stood, stretching. "I should close up soon." "Roads'll freeze." Ilara didn't move. She looked at the rain, the blurred reflections of streetlights, then wrote something small, deliberate. "Stay a minute." He did. She turned the notebook toward him again. A new sentence waited there. "You wrote you're still heard. Why?" Jonas looked down at the words, then at her. He took a breath before answering. "Because you looked like someone everyone used to listen to, but no one heard anymore." The air between them tightened. Not uncomfortable, just full of something real. She wrote slowly. "And now?" He shrugged. "Now you listen better than anyone I know." Her eyes flickered downward, the faintest tremor in her jaw. She closed the notebook gently. A silence stretched, heavy with unsaid things. Jonas broke it softly. "You know, when my nephew was little, he'd ask why people moved their mouths so much. I told him it's because they're afraid silence might tell the truth first." Ilara looked up. Her expression shifted, something between surprise and recognition. She reached for the nearest thing, an old receipt, and wrote on its back, "Maybe truth only survives in silence." Jonas read it, then smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's why we get along." The rain eased. The sky dimmed into that violet hour where everything softens. Jonas turned off the overhead light, leaving only the desk lamp glowing between them. Ilara stood, fingers brushing lightly over the metal frame of the bike he'd been fixing. "You cold?" he asked instinctively. She shook her head, then wrote, "I forgot what quiet warmth feels like." He didn't answer. He just looked at her, long enough for her to look back. No words, no movement, just the weight of 2 lives that had begun to listen the same way. When she finally stepped outside, the air had gone still. The rain had stopped completely. Jonas followed her to the door, leaning against the frame. "Drive careful," he said. She hesitated, then wrote one last thing. "You changed something in me." He studied the words. Serious now. "Then promise me something." She waited. "Don't go back to being noise," he said quietly. She didn't write a reply. She simply looked at him, then nodded once. Back home, the apartment felt different. Less sterile, less echoing. On her table lay the notes. "Still heard somehow. Some engines stall for rest. You're still heard." And now, she placed another beside them. The one she'd written on the receipt. "Maybe truth only survives in silence." She arranged them side by side. The paper edges curled slightly in the warmth. It looked almost like a conversation. Fragments of two lives written without sound. For the first time since the accident, Alara didn't feel the need to speak again. Not because she'd given up, but because silence no longer frightened her. It carried memory, meaning, even connection. And somewhere in that quiet, she could almost hear him, not his voice, but his steadiness. The next morning, before leaving for work, she wrote a small note and tucked it inside an envelope. On the front, she wrote only his name. Inside, "Silence isn't what's left when sound is gone. It's what sound was always trying to say." When Jonas found it later that day, folded neatly on his workbench, he read it 3 times before setting it down. He didn't smile, didn't speak. Instead, he reached for his wrench and kept working. The same rhythm, the same quiet hum. But the air around him had changed. It carried something invisible, like the sound of something being heard without needing to be said. The days that followed moved without urgency. Winter settled deep into the city, a grey hush over streets and glass. Alara moved through her office like someone rediscovering her footing. Meetings ran smoother now. Her notes, brief, exact, spoke more clearly than her former speeches ever did. People listened, but not to her voice, to her presence. At night, though, she still found herself pausing before her window. Below, headlights drifted through mist like thoughts half-formed. She would think of Jonas, not the words he said, but the way he waited for silence to finish speaking first. There was something unexplainable about that kind of patience. The way it steadied a room, a person, even a wound. The weekend came with snow. She drove to the edge of the industrial district, parking outside his garage. The door was half open. The radio played faintly, some old tune with too much static. Jonas was hunched over an engine, sleeves rolled, jaw tight in concentration. When he noticed her, he straightened. "You're early," he said. She raised her notepad. "Habit," he grinned. "That's a dangerous word in your world." "Not all habits are bad," she wrote. He nodded, then gestured toward the small heater humming in the corner. "Coffee?" She nodded once. They drank in silence, the sound of tools soft in the background. He spoke first. "I fixed the bike." She turned curious. "The one for your father?" "Yeah," he said. "Took months, but when I finally got the engine to turn, it didn't sound right. Too smooth, like it forgot how to remember." She looked at him, pen still. "You think machines remember?" He wiped his hands with a rag. "Maybe not, but people build them to hold what they can't say." She paused, then wrote, "Then maybe silence is a machine too." He studied her face, not to interpret, but to understand. "That mean it helps us remember?" She nodded. "Yes, it keeps what words ruin." He exhaled. "That's true." The radio clicked off mid-song. Neither moved to fix it. After a while, she reached into her bag and handed him something. A small box, wrapped in brown paper. He blinked. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a pen. Old-fashioned, heavy, with his initials etched faintly on the side. "It's..." He stopped, searching for a word. She wrote, "You wrote the first thing that reached me. Thought you deserved something better than a pencil stub." He laughed under his breath. "You make it sound like I changed the world." "Maybe you changed the silence," she wrote. He set the pen down carefully, as though it might break under the weight of her meaning. The air turned warmer. Outside, snow began to fall, slow, unhurried flakes drifting through yellow light. Jonas moved closer to the window. "You ever miss it?" he asked. She didn't need him to explain. Her hand hesitated, then wrote, "Sometimes. Mostly when I remember what it sounded like to be certain." He nodded quietly. "Certainty's overrated. Half the world hides behind it," she added, "and the other half hides behind silence." Maybe both sides need each other, he said. She met his gaze, something steady between them. Maybe they already do. Time thinned. The way it does when nothing dramatic happens but everything matters. He fixed a broken shelf. She rearranged his papers. They spoke less, moved more. Each gesture carried intention. The passing of a wrench, the brushing of sleeves, the way her hair slipped loose and he didn't look away. The air inside the garage wasn't quiet anymore. It listened. Later, as she prepared to leave, Jonas said softly, "You ever think about teaching people how to hear without sound?" She tilted her head. "I'm still learning myself." "Well," he said, glancing at the photograph still pinned to his wall, the children signing mid-motion. "You'd be good at it," she wrote. "You make it sound like I've already started." He smiled. "Maybe you have." When she stepped outside, the snow reached her shoes. The city lights blurred again, but this time she didn't see distance, only texture. Jonas followed her to the door. "You okay driving in this?" She nodded, then paused. She wrote, "You still write notes to strangers?" "Sometimes," he said. Not all of them read them. She tore a small page from her pad, wrote something quickly, folded it, and handed it to him. He waited until she drove away before opening it. The paper read, "Some of us didn't need to read them. We already heard them." That night, Elara lay in bed, the faint sound of wind outside her window. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant about the upcoming press conference. She turned it face down. Her eyes drifted toward the collection of notes on her dresser. Each one now looked less like a wound and more like a path. A week later, Jonas found a letter in his mail slot, heavy cream paper, embossed with her company's insignia. Inside was a short handwritten message. "We're funding a new program, vocational mechanics for people with speech or hearing loss. Your garage will be the first training site." At the bottom, beneath her printed name, she'd signed, not in cursive, but in a single hand-drawn symbol, the sign for listen. Jonas folded the paper once, twice, then held it against the light. He didn't smile. He just breathed in, slow and full, as if silence had finally turned into something living. That evening, he reopened the garage's side window to let the night in. Snow had stopped. The air was still. He placed her note on the workbench beside his old wrench, and beside it, her pen. He began writing something on a scrap of cardboard. The words were simple, written in careful strokes. Silence taught us to speak differently. He pinned it above the door where she would see it the next time she came. And for the first time in months, when he turned off the lights, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt shared. The first thaw came quietly. Snow melted from the gutters in long silver threads, and the streets began to hum again. Engines, footsteps, the low murmur of life resuming. Elara watched from her office window as the city softened back into motion, but she no longer felt part of its noise. Not apart from it, simply beyond its need to shout. The conference that morning was her first public appearance since the accident. Dozens of journalists, cameras, the familiar choreography of anticipation. Her assistant adjusted the microphone before realizing the irony. She shook her head once. No mic needed. Instead, she placed a small notepad on the podium. On it, written in deliberate, steady strokes, "Silence taught me how to hear again." The room stilled. A few flashes went off. But even the reporters sensed something fragile, a truth that couldn't be packaged. Her assistant read her statement aloud. Concise, grounded, unadorned. A new initiative for inclusive vocational training, a partnership with small garages across the country. A starting point, not a solution. When the applause came, it was careful, almost reverent. Elara didn't bow, didn't wave. She simply closed her notebook and looked out across the crowd. Not for validation, but for understanding. And somewhere near the back, she imagined someone standing quietly, listening the same way he always had. Later that evening, she drove without direction. The skyline dimmed behind her, replaced by the muted sprawl of the industrial outskirts. When she turned the final corner and saw the familiar flicker of the garage sign, her breath caught, not from surprise, but recognition. Jonas was outside, rolling a toolbox back inside. He looked up as her headlights swept across the wet ground. No words passed. None were needed. She stepped out, the air smelling faintly of metal and spring. He nodded once, a greeting folded into simplicity. Didn't think I'd see you tonight, she wrote. Neither did I. Inside, the heater still rattled. The same tools hung in the same careful order, but something was different. A new workbench, a second chair, and above the door, pinned neatly on the wall, silence taught us to speak differently. She stopped beneath it, touched the corner of the sign gently. Then she wrote, "You kept it." Jonas wiped his hands on a cloth. "You gave it meaning." They shared tea instead of coffee. The steam rose between them, slow and fragile. He asked, "How was the conference?" She wrote, louder than it needed to be. He chuckled, "That's the world for you." Then she added, "But some listened." That's all it takes. A few minutes passed before she spoke again, or rather, wrote. Her pen moved slower this time. I used to believe control was the same as strength. Jonas watched her write. Now, I think strength is what stays soft when the world goes hard. He leaned back slightly. You learned that here? She looked at him. I learned it from someone who fixes things that still work. Just not the same way anymore. He smiled, eyes lowering. Guess we both fix things. Outside, rain began. Soft, uncertain drops that tapped against the roof like a quiet rehearsal. Jonas turned off the lights, leaving only the small desk lamp glowing between them. In that half light, the silence grew, not empty, not heavy, but earned. Ilara reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. When she opened it, Jonas saw his own handwriting, his old note from the day they met. You're still heard. She placed it on the table between them, next to the one she'd written in return. Silence isn't what's left when sound is gone. It's what sound was always trying to say. He looked at them both, side by side, the beginning and the echo. Then he said quietly, Guess they were always the same message. Neither moved for a long while. The rain outside steadied, filling the space with soft rhythm. Ilara reached for her pen one last time and wrote, Not everything needs to be fixed. Jonas read it, then nodded. Some things just need to be held. Her eyes lingered on his face, steady, unhurried. She didn't look away. When she finally stood, she gathered her coat slowly. Jonas followed her to the door but didn't open it for her. He knew she didn't need that kind of help anymore. Drive safe, he said, his voice low. She turned, wrote something small on a page, tore it out, and pressed it into his palm. Then she left. After she was gone, Jonas unfolded the paper. It read, Some silences are just beginnings. He placed it next to the others. You're still heard. Silence isn't what's left when sound is gone. And now, some silences are just beginnings. The papers fluttered slightly in the draft. Together, they looked like one unfinished sentence. The kind that keeps meaning more each time it's read. Jonas leaned against the doorframe, watching the night turn still again. Somewhere in the distance, an engine started. Not loud, not hurried, just sure. He smiled faintly, the kind that lives halfway between memory and presence, and for the first time in a long while, the quiet felt complete. Some stories end in silence, not from loss, but understanding. Ilara didn't find her voice again. She found something rarer, a listener who made quiet safe. And in that stillness, both learned the same truth, that to be heard is not to speak, but to be understood without needing to.